So I want to draw a line under that bit. That was a little bit of an explanation as to why context matters. It has a profound impact on the scriptures. And I want you to make sure you understand that, because that really is the focus of what we're going to look at over these next 3 days. I want to show you some stuff. Hopefully it will speak for itself. But then I want to read some of the scriptures in the light of this new knowledge and show you how, in some cases, it just adds depth. In other cases, it actually changes the understanding. Okay? So that's why I'm explaining this to you. Now, in order to build the context, we need to do a bit of background on Rome and Roman culture. I am not an expert in Greek or Roman mythology, okay? I'm not an expert in Latin, although I did go to Latin lessons in the old Shakespeare schoolroom where, well, I won't go into all the detail of that. It wasn't my fondest moments back in schooling. But I've forgotten most of it because I didn't like the teacher. So, but what I do want to do is give you an insight into a very abridged history of Rome. So what I've got pre-Rome with some of the myths upon which the Rome is built. And I'm going to go through and give a very abridged history, like I say, to get to the popes. So you can understand the transition from the founding of Rome through to the popes, because I think it's important that we can join the dots. Okay? You need to see the transfer from one to the next. So, the history of Rome, originally a city-state, latterly the Roman Empire, is vast and spans more than 2,000 years. Okay? I'm not going to go year by year, I promise. It dates back to the 8th century BC. Okay? Although archaeologists and other experts say that Rome has been inhabited in one form or another on this site for many decades and centuries before that. So it's one of the reasons it got the name the Eternal City. It's believed to have been settlers or dwellers in this place right back into antiquity. Okay? Like I said, it dates back to the 8th century BC, continued until the fall of Rome in 476 AD, although the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople as its capital, remained until 1453. So it's one of the longest standing empires in one form or another over history. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Turks, and what we've got latterly is the Ottoman Empire and modern-day Turkey. While territories and rulers have changed hands over the years, the influence of Rome extends far beyond the physical borders and that of the years that I've stated, far beyond the time span that I've created. We are still living in the aftermath of the Roman Empire. I need to make that clear. We don't suddenly, when an empire finishes, in that sense, when Byzantine Empire falls in 1453 or Rome falls in 476, it's not like everything suddenly stops. Cultures continue. The influence of these things continue. It just gets absorbed or dispersed into other cultures and other thinking. So much of the way that the world works today is still founded on the Roman way of doing things. Our calendar. So much of our terminology, the words that we use, so many of the way we think and describe stuff is still based on the Roman culture. But the Roman culture is also understood to be the Greco-Roman culture, because there's such a blurring of the lines between the Greek culture and the Roman culture. The way we think, the way we process, the philosophical way that we understand stuff is all rooted back here. It's necessary to understand something of the origin of Rome, a blend of fact with traditions and legend. So what I'm going to explain to you in just a second is there's probably some truth to it somewhere, but really it's the thing of myth and legend now. But if we don't understand this, and you'll understand why I'm going to share these things with you in just a second, you don't understand the foundation of thinking that the culture was formed on. So, I want to explain two legends to you now. Two legends that go right back to the beginning of Rome, and I've got Ariel here as my checkpoint if I get these wrong. The one is less known. The second will probably be a little bit more familiar for those who have any recollection of this sort of history for them. And the first one relates to a guy called Aeneas. Just anybody with a show of hands know who Aeneas is? Okay, it doesn't matter. I'm going to explain it anyway, so there's no real need. There's actually a statue just down the road as we walk out of the hotel of Aeneas. Now, Aeneas, let me go back a little bit further. So we've got Virgil, who's a Roman poet and historian, who records the legend of Aeneas. He was a hero of Troy. Everyone remembers hearing about the Trojan horse and the fall of Troy. He's a hero of Troy and Rome. Okay, and his history actually goes back to Troy. So a guy called Anchises, who was of the Trojan royal family, the Trojan royal line, is on Mount Ida. And Mount Ida means the mountain of the goddess. And the particular goddess that we're talking about is Aphrodite. Okay, Aphrodite in Greek, or Venus in Roman. So he's tending his sheep on the mountain of the goddess. And whilst he's tending his sheep, Aphrodite takes a look down and thinks, oh, he's a bit of all right. And enamored with his beauty, the two meet and Aeneas is born. Okay? So the point here is that Aeneas then, who in theoretically was an actual guy, charts his lineage to the gods. He is literally a son of God. Okay? When the Greeks won the victory over Troy, again, reference to the Trojan horse, Aeneas is the guy who led the survivors through a great many adventures around which there's all sorts of legend and stuff told. And eventually he founds a place called Lavinium, which is the parent town of a place called Alba Longa. Now, those two names might not mean anything to you, but if we got a map out, we'd be sitting very close to those two places right now, okay? Because effectively, these Lavinium and then Alba Longa are the regions that surround Rome currently. But we're going back, nearly 3,000 years, okay? Stay with me here. Julius Caesar claimed lineage back to Aeneas. And it's this lineage that caused Julius Caesar to be convinced that he was divine in nature. Okay? It's important that we get this from the get-go. So that's the first one. So just hold that for a second. So we've got this guy Aeneas, who is born from a union with a man and a goddess. Yeah? Literally, he is divine, and he is the son of the gods. The next one is a little bit better known. It's about two guys called Romulus and Remus. That name ring a bell for anybody? Yeah? There's a statue just up the way of a she-wolf and Romulus and Remus sucking on the nipples of the she-wolf. Okay? And I'll explain to you how this works. So, traditional legend tells that Romulus and Remus were the twin sons of a lady called Rhea Silvia. Now, Rhea Silvia was the daughter of a guy called Numitor. Again, names which probably mean nothing to you. Numitor was the king of Alba Longa, which is the place I just mentioned relating to Aeneas. Okay, so there's a connection here. He's the king of Alba Longa. Numitor was deposed from his throne by his younger brother, Amulius, who forced Rhea, so this is Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal Virgin. Okay, and he forced her to become a Vestal Virgin, which is basically a priestess who had to maintain a vow of chastity to serve in the temple of Vesta. Okay, I won't go into who Vesta was right now, but she was a goddess of the day, and it was all connected with fires and stuff like that. So he wanted her to become a Vestal Virgin in order to prevent her from giving birth to any potential claimants to the throne. Okay, this is the thing about it. Rhea, however, catches the eye of the god Mars. I know. How this works, I'm not sure. They're sitting on a cloud somewhere like, oh, I like that one. So Mars comes down, meets Rhea. You understand what's supposed to have taken place. And the twin boys, Romulus and Remus, are born. So what we have is we have another virgin birth, immaculate conception story in the origin of Rome. Okay? And the offspring of that is Romulus and Remus, who of course then can chart their lineage back to the gods. Are you with me so far? Good. Sort of. When Amulius, the brother that had deposed his older brother, finds out, he insists that the two boys get drowned. So they get put in a trough on the river Tiber. But the trough, instead of sinking, floats down the river Tiber, comes to rest underneath a fig tree, and where they are discovered by a she-wolf and a woodpecker. Who knew? Yeah. A she-wolf and a woodpecker. Okay. And the wolf and the woodpecker are apparently both sacred to Mars. Okay. The she-wolf suckled and fed them until they were found by a herdsman called Faustulus. Okay. When the boys grow up, they killed their grandfather's brother, whatever that makes him. They restore their grandfather to the throne, and they then go on to establish a city in the site where they were rescued, which is here, Rome. It wasn't called Rome back then. There was a power struggle then in this city between Romulus and Remus, because both wanted to lead and only one could do it. Romulus kills his brother Remus. If it had been the other way around, this would be called Reme and not Rome. Yeah? Somebody got it. Romulus then rules Rome from 753 to 715 BC. 753 to 715. So immediately, in the origin of Rome, we've got two separate legends which talk of a god or a goddess coming down to earth, having intercourse, and offspring being born. You understand why I'm telling you these stories, right? And in the one instance, it's connected to a virgin, literally a Vestal virgin is the one to give birth. So it's a virgin birth story again. Interestingly, Romulus' death is also a matter of legend. Tradition states that he vanished in a storm or a cloud amidst the high-ranking officials in Rome at that time. This gave the foundation for the claim that he ascended to become a god, and that all successive rulers of Rome also were therefore destined for divinity. Okay? Hopefully you're joining the dots with what I'm saying. I just want to show you very quickly. This is a coin from the Emperor Augustus era. Okay? The inscription on the coin, Augustus Divi F, and the F is the shorthand for Filius, or Phyllis rather, says Augustus, divine son, or divine son of a god. Okay? And this is an inheritance which started back with Romulus and Remus, or Romulus in particular. And the concept being that every successive ruler of Rome was destined for divinity. Okay? Now, Augustus, who was the first proper emperor of Rome, Luke 2 verse 1 says, "Now it happened in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus to register all the world's inhabitants." This guy literally understood himself to be a god, and all successive after that. But it's interesting, isn't it, when we look at other scriptures, Luke 20, because in Yeshua's day, Emperor Tiberius was the guy who ruled. We've got the town of Tiberias up on the Galilee, haven't we, that we know about. It says, "Is it permitted for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" the scripture says. But carefully considering their treachery, Yeshua said to them, "Show me a denarius," which would have looked something like this, but with Tiberius' head on it instead. "Whose image and inscription does it have?" And they said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Well then, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." But of course, every Caesar is a god. in their own eyes. And there were temples literally erected to the worship of the different Caesars. Okay? So, Romulus. Following Romulus were a succession of kings, consuls, military generals, dictators. Julius Caesar really was the first key dictator. And Julius Caesar rules from 46 to 44 BC, only 2 years. Okay? And yet he had a profound impact on the whole Roman Empire. And after Julius Caesar, he gets assassinated. We have a short break, and then we have Emperor Augustus as the first emperor. And remember, Julius Caesar charted his lineage back to Aeneas. So he considered himself literally from a divine family line. After Romulus' divine ascension, a system of religious worship was established and cultivated, including priestly orders and temples to a variety of gods. Okay? So the Greek-Roman worldview was polytheistic. There were many, many gods, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. The priests of the temples of ancient Rome were called pontiffs. Which literally translated, and Ariel hopefully won't correct me here, there's two variations on how that can be translated. One is to understand it as a bridge builder, and the other is a preparer of the road. The concept being, of course, that as a pontiff, they are that connection point between God and man. The chief or greatest priest was called the Pontifex Maximus. And this is the title that the Pope holds today. Unlike many priestly offices, the Pontifex Maximus did not serve for a fixed period, but for life. Okay? A distinction in the Roman leadership was made between military, religious, and political elements. Okay, so there would be separate military, political, and religious leadership initially. However, the honour and power attached to the title Pontifex Maximus was highly envied. As Julius Caesar climbed to power, he was elected Pontifex Maximus and held the office until his death. The title eventually passed to Emperor Augustus, who put an end to the concept of election of the pontifices. The office of Pontifex Maximus then passed from emperor to emperor, which in effect made the emperor a combined head of state and religion. Okay, and that's where the title and the power base lay from that point forward. State and religion became one. Constantine the Great, who rules from 306 to 337, was the first Christian emperor. He also held the office of Pontifex Maximus. And it was in this authority as the head of the imperial religion that he imposed Christianity onto the Roman Empire. That was the power from which he was able to do it. It was in this authority he also called things like the Council of Nicaea. It was that authority that he was able to gather together bishops or leaders of the religious orders in whatever way. And in that authority, he was effectively, under imperial law, the head of the church. Okay? I want to point out that until Constantine, and arguably after Constantine, Pontifex Maximus was a title given to the head of the pagan religions. It wasn't Christian in any way, shape, or form. Okay? The office of Pontifex Maximus continued to pass through successive emperors until 381 AD. And in 381 AD, Emperor Gratian comes to power. And he refuses the title. And he refuses because he is also a Christian emperor, and he believes there's a conflict between what he believes and holding the title of Pontifex Maximus. What's interesting, though, is none of the previous Christian emperors have the same conflict. When Gratian refuses this, the priesthood, who've basically come to him and said, right, you're the new emperor, so we're going to bestow this crown upon you, They then hand the title to a guy called Damasus, or Saint Damasus I, who becomes the first bishop of Rome, who is also the Pontifex Maximus. The title and the office has been handed down the papal line ever since, until today, with Pope Francis. It's important to join the dots, guys, because there's a lot of speculations about this stuff. And of course, people are very quick to say, yeah, the title Pontifex Maximus is just a name. It doesn't have any attachment to the pagan overarching. I don't believe that's the case. But there's more to say on it. Has anybody ever heard of a guy called Tertullian? Okay, he's one of the early church fathers. And he was actually a guy who wrote in around about 220 AD. And interestingly, his writings, he was considered a heretic by many of his day because he wrote from a counter perspective to the majority of the bishops of Rome. So he was opposed to a lot of what was going on in the power base in Rome, okay? And he writes this. So 220 AD, okay, Constantine doesn't come to power until 313. So this is before any bishops are called Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex Maximus, the title, still firmly sits within the pagan overarching religions. Okay, does that make sense? Tertullian refers to the Pontifex Maximus, that is the Bishop of Bishops, in his writings. So if anybody wants the reference on that, you go to Tertullian, type in On Modesty, which is one of his texts, and he refers to the Pontifex Maximus, that is the Bishop of Bishops. So what Tertullian is doing in that moment is he's looking at the bishops, the Christian bishops in Rome, and he connects them, even in this day, prior to the fact that Pontifex Maximus has been handed to him, he connects them with this pagan ruling authority, even in that day. It's interesting because he makes this reference in the context of challenging an edict made by the particular pope of that day, who's a guy called St. Calixtus. And we are going to the catacombs of St. Calixtus on Monday. All right? So Tertullian clearly perceives that Calixtus is not a follower of the true faith, but is in some way connected to these pagan religious orders, despite the fact that the Catholic Church will tell us he's a pope and he was a good Christian. I want to just go back to the papal line very briefly, and then we're nearly there for the night. The Apostle Peter, I think everybody here probably knows, the Apostle Peter is considered the first bishop of Rome, or the first pope. Although the title Bishop of Rome or Pope didn't come into play until much, much later. And actually trying to ascertain the details of how the papal line was handed on, how successive popes were chosen, all the rest of it, there's very little material out there at all. Most of it's tradition, stuff that you can find in things like the New Catholic Encyclopedia and stuff like that. It's very difficult to find any hard and fast evidence. So what you're operating on is writings by the church fathers that were much, much later that refer back. So arguably it was orally handed down the line and points back to what happened in the early first century. So the Catholic Church are keen to show an unbroken lineage from Peter. It's upon that which they base their authority as head of the Catholic or universal church across the world. Okay? And the scripture that they always go back to is Matthew 16. Matthew 16, I'll read for you. When Yeshua came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They answered, "Some say John the Immerser or the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets." He said, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Yeshua said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also tell you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my community, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will have been forbidden in heaven, and what you permit on earth will have been permitted in heaven." That's the foundation upon which the Catholic Church builds its authority and starts the papal lineage. Okay, but I believe there's a fundamental flaw in their interpretation of that. In Aramaic, the name Peter is Kepha, or Kephas, which means rock. Now, I don't believe that Peter was the one they were building, that Yeshua was building his church upon, but upon the rock of understanding that Yeshua is the Messiah. Okay? I'm sure I don't have to convince you guys. But the reference to the keys of the kingdom as well, we will see a lot of symbolism relating to the keys that Peter was apparently wielding. We'll see keys on their own, keys in the hands of Peter. We'll see all sorts of different references to keys as we go around about the place. It's all coming back to this particular scripture. This is what they're saying. The Catholic Church is the only church with that direct lineage which gives it the authority. Okay? That's where they root. The Catholic Church teaches that Peter appointed a guy called Linus as his successor, although, as I said, this can't be verified. Later writers, people like Irenaeus, Jerome, Eusebius, and Chrysostom, make reference to Linus, but only sometime after his death. Okay? Detail of how the early popes were selected is vague. Little written to bring definitive clarity. However, it appears that some were personally appointed by their predecessors, others by election, and in the case of Damasus I, by imperial decree from the emperor. And at that point, where Gratian hands over to Damasus, that's really the transfer of power of this pagan high priestly office, which has remained in the hands of the Catholic Church ever since.